Welcome back to Normal Island. I'm Curtis Daly, and I'm honoured to be joined by writer and political economist Dr. Ashok Kumar. Ashok, how are you doing?
I'm all right, man. How you doing?
I'm very good. I was liking our energy behind the scenes. You know, you were raving to the beat we got on the countdown,
It was a banger, man.
it
I
was a
was just like,
banger.
I need to know where you got this. Who's the artist?
I mean, it's called stock audio because that's all we can afford. But do you know what? It sounds pretty good.
Oh, I thought you got someone special to make it. It was good. Yeah.
Maybe one day.
One day.
One day. We've got a great show coming up for you guys. This is what the stories we're covering tonight. Corbyn attacks Rayner for selling off allotments. Twitter helps stoke Southport riots. Report finds. And Lindsay Hoyle caught blocking secret emails to Israel. As always, remember to like the stream. And if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. We'll be getting to your comments at the end. So please make sure you are busy in the chat, as you always are. But on to our first story. Jeremy Corbyn has come after Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner on her plans to sell off allotments. Jeremy Corbyn has criticised Angela Rayner, the local government secretary, for rules that allow councils to sell allotments to fund day-to-day spending, saying it makes the future of these precious spaces even more perilous. Rules on council asset sales mean local authorities can sell off sites to help deliver transformation and investor-safe projects they would otherwise not be able to afford. Corbyn, writing for The Telegraph, said the possible sale of allotments would fill many with deep dismay. Allotments have always been under threat from developers. Now that threat seems to have government backing, which makes the future of these precious spaces even more perilous. Corbyn also took to Twitter and said this: "Is this government going to put the nail in the coffin of the joy of digging ground for potatoes on a cold, wet February Sunday afternoon? The battle for the grassroots is on." Now, look, this isn't just a story about drama. This speaks to the deeper issue of Labour. To me, this seems to be an obsession with continuing the Thatcherite economic policy, selling everything off. Jim McMahon, who is the Housing, Communities and Local Government Minister, said, "We know how important allotments are for communities, and this is why strict criteria is in place to protect them. The rules on the sale of assets have been in place since 2016, have not changed. Ministerial approvals for the sale of allotments in 2024 were lower than the average for recent years." Now, this is a bit confusing because Labour are saying they haven't changed the rules. Yet previously it was for local authorities to make the decisions on selling off spaces. Now ministers can do it. Now, the reason why they're doing this is due to many councils going bankrupt. You only need to look at Birmingham. The thing is, it's not the Tories in power anymore. Labour are in power, so they could give more funding to local councils. Ashok, what's your thoughts? I know for most people, the politics of allotments doesn't keep them up at night, but do you think this is another Thatcherite strategy of selling things off for a quick buck?
Look, at the local level, there are only regressive forms of taxation, right? So the only way you can generate revenue at a local level, anyone involved in local government knows this, council tax, which was a sweetener from the poll tax, which is highly regressive, means that it disproportionately affects the poor. Fines, which are the most regressive forms of extracting, revenue. And there's business rates, which are set nationally, which are not as regressive, but also potentially are passed on to consumers, but really they're not as regressive. There's no ability for local governments to extract revenue in a progressive way. So this is a way to basically try and, again, yes, sell off things that should be in the public interest. Because fundamentally what Rayner's trying to do, and Rayner's consistently does this in the most sort of crass and cynical way, is she won't, when she would get up and say some kind of stereotypically kind of she'd have an outburst in Parliament and then people would attack her. And it was such a obvious way of trying to be to get her working class bona fides without actually standing up for working class people. So then they'd be oh, she's being attacked because she's working class. Now, I'm not attacking her because of her working class background. What I'm saying is the way that you can stay true to your working class background is by actually taxing wealth, taxing the rich, taxing incomes at a higher level, distributing wealth more. Obviously, we know this. And they could easily do that. They could even borrow borrow and give it into local communities, which will actually be spent, which will spur the economy and keep us away from a dangerous recession, because we know we're moving in that direction, obviously, because demand is falling, because there's less money in people's pockets. If you gave local governments, for example, the power to set rent controls, which even Sadiq Khan and others have backed to give local authorities the power to do rent controls, then you would actually have people have more money in their pockets, not being siphoned off by these massive institutional investors and landlords, institutional landlords who are now entering from the US, the market, siphoning it off like a parasite. So all it is like these cities where we're toiling endlessly and like a vortex, like a succubus. These landlords and these like institutional investors are just siphoning off half, 3/4 of our salaries for doing nothing, for literally having a roof over our shoulders. If we actually did rent controls, that money would go back into local communities, and actually we could get higher business rates. The greater the circulation, the more the tax revenue is, right? There are loads and loads of things that could be done that are actually progressive. Instead, this is culture war. They're saying, okay, allotments, that's what white middle class people do, which we know is nonsense, because actually loads of people who live in high density housing, the 7th, 8th, 10th, 11th floor of a building, who have no public space, this is their way to like actually have public space. I live in East London. I live in Tower Hamlets. The allotments are where loads of Bengali families and Somali families grow vegetables that you typically wouldn't get in markets here that are very important for our cuisine, right? So it's like the idea that this is some kind of middle class thing is only in the minds of people that don't live in major metropolitan cities, and it's in the minds of it's just a caricature, right? This is something that many working class people and people of color and working class people of color and just people need. That's why you have massive 7, 8, 9 year waiting lists in my neighborhood to have a spot in an allotment. They're hugely popular and they're in need. And so the thing is, there's this kind of setup where they say, oh, we want to meet people's like essential needs. I'm sorry, we want bread, but we want roses too. We want the ability to live, but we want the ability to exist as a community and like have greenery and not suffocate under smog. Cities, honestly, if you look at American cities, I grew up in Chicago, they're built on a grid. And there's no public spaces. There's really not that much parking space. Like in parks, in like New York, for example, you got Central Park, you got Prospect Park, you got like Marcus Garvey Park, etc. You got a handful of parks. You go to Chicago, you got a handful of Wicker Park, a few other parks, right? If you come to London, they're everywhere. Why? Because the city was built prior to the emergence of capitalism. Under capitalism, everything, like Marx says, you have Marx behind you, I've got Marx behind me. He says everything is reduced to the commodity form. Everything is mediated through the market. Everything is for exchange value. Nothing should be for use value. Like there's some utility that I have as a human being that isn't just mediated to the market, that isn't reduced to its commodity, right? Reduced to be like liquefied for the accumulation of capital. And so that's why parks, which are just where people should go to enjoy their lives, that's why parks don't exist in cities that are built just for capitalist accumulation. So allotments are part of that. Like it's not just some kind of thing that people do for fun. It's a necessity, and we have to actually treat it as an essential characteristic. And so instead of taxing the rich, instead of taxing corporations more, actually they're pushing for corporation tax to get lower than the Tories. They were attacking the Tories when Rishi Sunak was in power because they said the corporation tax is too low. Instead of doubling our defense budget, they should actually circulate. This is not good for the economy. They could actually get more money into local government. That circulates. That comes into the hands of poor people who actually spend that money. And that leads to growth. These people, and I'll end with this. Sorry if I'm talking too long, Curtis.
No, please.
The thing is, these people's model of growth, they constantly talk about growth. Growth, there's two forms of growth. There's like many forms of growth, but there's two forms of growth. There's supply side growth, which is this kind of neoclassical idea of what growth is, which is we need to get corporations to have more money who will then invest that money. In the real economy, there's not much growth. So if you get wealthy people and corporations more money, they're going to put it into credit default swaps. They're going to financialize it. They're going to put it into buying up more property and siphoning up more money and increasing rents from poor people, right? But then there's demand-led growth. So demand-led growth is, let's still talk about growth. I mean, there's a whole critique of growth, obviously. I mean, growth is also what might be killing us. But let's just talk in the paradigm they've said. We want growth. There's demand-led growth. You get more money into more people's hands rather than in some Cayman Island offshore account, and you get more money into more people's hands. That circulates up and down the country, and that leads to demand-led growth. So there's supply side, which is at the point of production, And there's demand side, which is at the point of consumption, demand, supply. And you say we get more money at the point of consumption through taxing the rich and through progressive forms of taxation, and that actually leads to greater outcomes even in the paradigm that they've set up about growth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about growth, because I mean, it's so true. The way the mainstream media and politicians talk about growth, it's like this. It's this one thing, and I use this example, like the way politicians measure growth. It's kind of like buying a pair of trousers, and you're looking at the length and not the width. It doesn't tell the full story. In fact, the way the media looks at growth is basically on corporate profits. A lot of growth is also consumer debt. Just if you're in debt to a bank or these days Klarna is with everything, private companies, looks good on the profits. Doesn't mean that the average person is richer. Supply side growth is I mean, I have my problems with growth too in terms of analyzing the economy that way, but I think it's at least another dimension to look at the health of the economy and the health of the average person. I also appreciate when talking about allotments, you managed to get some Marxist theory in there. I've got a lot of time for that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a very good point that a lot of people think that this is a sort of middle class sort of thing to do. But actually, no, working class communities use allotments, and there's a lot of use value from it. They're trying to get their exchange value, obviously, because they have to raise the funds for councils. But the point I was making earlier is that it's no longer the Tories in power who are setting the budgets for the councils. Labour in power, they could just give councils more money so they don't have to sell it off. And I suppose one might say, I mean, this is not something I particularly agree with, right? But because I think selling off to private developers does not sit right with me. But if these developers are to build housing, at least more houses are getting built. Given that we're in a housing crisis, could some good come out of this? I know it's selling off spaces that they shouldn't do, but if it meant there was more housing, could that be like a positive from a bad situation?
The thing about it is there's this whole, this is a whole bigger debate about housing stock. We need to build more. Undeniably, building more would be a positive. Absolutely. I'm not denying that at all. The point is that isn't the solution in itself. And I'm sure you've had discussions and debates about this before. Actually building up by monopolistic buyers is what you're seeing now. It's not little mom and pop people selling one place or two places. It's these massive buyers buying huge amounts of rental properties and elevating the price to a certain amount. So that means that when you have monopoly, like buyers, or what Kalecki calls a high degree of monopoly power. So it's not like they're not monopolies, because you don't really have pure monopolies other than natural monopolies, but huge landlords, institutional buyers that can set prices, and there's a social condition in which they set those prices. What that then results in is no matter how many more you build, they're not going below that threshold, right? And so the argument that all you have to do is build more simply does not add up. And this is why I'm a big advocate of rent controls. And the reason why I think rent controls are important, and even though housing prices and land prices have technically fallen now, what you do, if you set, we set rent controls, for example, what that does is it means that the property values go down. Once property values go down, you've decommodified housing. It makes it so that councils can also buy property much easier. It also makes it that this rent-seeking constituency, this constituency of an enormous amount of power, so landlords, developers, etc., who have, and people from the City of London, financiers, they don't feel the need to capture the state as much, because everything isn't mediated through housing prices. So when housing prices are through the roof, they have captured councils. It's deeply corrupt. They're pushing the council to sell off lands at cut rate prices. They're pushing the council to sell off some, there's an allotment near my house. It's like 90% Bengali aunties. They don't have much power. Some ghoul from the City of London, which we neighbor, will be like pushing the council. I mean, our council is very left-wing and wouldn't do that. But, when it was run by the Labour Party a few years ago, they're hugely corrupt. They would just push them, and they would push them off the land. You give these local authorities enough power to do that, there's a lot of state capture. So if I'm flying all over the place, but let's say you introduce rent controls, what we see happen time and time again is slowly what that leads to. It puts caps on the profitability of housing. Once you set caps on the profitability of housing, it snowballs to allow for the decommodification of housing. It means that we don't see housing as a commodity. We see housing as a need. That's why, like in Britain all the time, when someone buys a house and it's the house they live in, it's their only house, they'll be like, my property. I'm like, why are you calling it your property? It's your home. Stop calling it your property. Like there's this thing in Britain where everything's like a property. I'm like, it's not your property, it's your home. And that's part of the language of commodification of the housing market. So it's like, if you put caps on it, then the housing prices and the value of housing as a commodity goes down. And councils, especially progressive councils like, Wandsworth and Islington and Tower Hamlets and other places, can actually buy those houses and build public housing on it. And it reduces, if we see the battle in society between, let's just say, be reductive here and say it's labor and capital. If we reduce the power of capital, it's like trench warfare. We reduce the profits of capital, we reduce the power of capital, we erode the self-interest of capital, we reduce the power as a vested interest of capital, then we can embolden and bolster the power of labor. And that's, by labor, I mean tenants and not the people who work and earn a living, not earn their living off of other people's labor. So I think the problem is, if you even look at London, actually housing prices have come down for a number of reasons. High interest rates, non-dom status going away, like a number of, even the renters bill has made it so it's not as profitable as before. So if we did say something like rent controls, these kinds of questions of selling off council property, doesn't go away completely, but it reduces it significantly, because now a builder, since 2017, since Brexit, building costs are enormous. Back in the day, before 2017, people would be like, I want to buy a house in London and other places, buy a house that needs a lot of work, because housing prices were high, but building costs were low. Whereas now, for the past 6-7 months to a year, and for the next year, housing prices have gone down, but building costs have gone up. So even if you introduce things that put limits on it, these questions wouldn't even come into, not that they would never come into the question of like housing prices being valuable or not being valuable, but it would just make it so it would be much more difficult to have this, really state capture to try and like turn allotments and parks and other things that should be for people's use into a means of exchange.
I could speak about this the entire show, but we'd have to move on. Very well said, by the way. But we are going to go on to our next story of the evening. A report from Amnesty released today has found that Twitter created a staggering amplification of hate that led to the Southport riots. Amnesty International has found that social media platform X played a role in the spread of false narratives and content which incited violence against Muslim and migrant communities. Our analysis of X open source code reveals that the platform's content ranking algorithms prioritize the type of content that can spread misinformation and hate with deeply inadequate safeguards to prevent human rights abuses. Our research demonstrates that these design choices significantly exacerbated human rights risks for racialized communities in the wake of the Southport riots and continue to present a serious human rights risk today. Amnesty International's analysis of X's open source recommender algorithm finds that the algorithm gives top priority to content that drives conversation, even if that conversation is driven by misinformation or hate. This is exacerbated by the artificial amplification of posts from premium verified subscribers, which are paid accounts. These systems enabled toxic, racist, and false content to thrive on X in the wake of the stabbings, which fueled and contributed to violence, including racist attacks. Sasha Deshmukh, Amnesty International UK's chief executive, gave a damning incitement. By amplifying hate and misinformation on such a massive scale, X acted like a petrol on the fire of racist violence in the aftermath of the Southport tragedy. The platform's algorithm not only failed to break the circuit and stop the spread of dangerous falsehoods, they are highly likely to have amplified them. 1 year on, it appears nothing has changed. Indeed, just 2 weeks ago, we saw false online rumours about the transfer of people seeking asylum spark protests outside the Britannia Hotel Canary Wharf. The UK's online safety regime fails to keep the public safe, and the risk of X fueling violence, discrimination, and social tensions remains as high as they were during the rioting last year. Now, of course, I don't think many people are surprised. We know that social media has done wonders for far-right circles to grow, with lies and misinformation spreading like wildfire. Twitter is certainly the biggest culprit, what with literal open Nazis crawling the platform. Yet it's still important that we have evidence compiled in a report. Now, earlier on today, I spoke to Pat de Bruyn, head of tech accountability and author of the report to discuss. Can you briefly summarise what you found on Twitter that led you to believe that the platform contributed to the Southport riots?
Hi, Curtis. Yeah, happy to do so. So, we've undertaken a technical investigation of X's algorithm. So, basically, all the publicly available code that we could get our hands on. And it revealed that there's kind of systematic biases built into the platform that promotes and amplifies content that's likely to elicit very strong reactions and controversy. And we found that very often that will include misinformation and hate speech. And this is combined with changes at X, at the company and the platform, where safeguards have been really done away with and diminished over the past few years. So a combination of those factors, the algorithmic design and these policy decisions, have really combined to create this fertile ground for hate and misinformation and racist content to spread at speed. So yeah, our analysis looked at the algorithm itself. It looked at the combination of these policy choices that have been made, and we also monitored the actual content that was going viral at the time of these racist riots that erupted in various parts of the UK last year. And the overall picture is quite damning. It reveals a platform that is designed to enable really severe human rights harms with an absolute minimum of safeguards in place.
You spoke about some changes. I mean, could you see a dramatic change in the way the behavior of the algorithm and the way posts are recommended when Elon Musk took over? Or has it been more gradual?
Well, I think it is important to acknowledge that, we at Amnesty have been documenting problems with Twitter as it then was for many years. It wasn't some perfect social media platform where we're free of harms and human rights issues prior to Musk's takeover. And we've been stating this publicly and campaigning on it since at least 2018. We had a report that came out back then called Toxic Twitter. We had another follow-up piece of research in 2020. And back then, we also found that it was rife with abusive content, harassment targeting women and gender minorities, for example, in the public sphere. So many of these problems are long-standing, but I do want to say as well, we didn't have, researchers didn't have the tools to be able to really analyze the algorithm that was like at the backbone of the platform back then. So it's very hard to make a direct comparison in the algorithm itself. But what we do know based on our analysis is that the algorithm, based on the most recent information that X has made available, is hardwired for harm. And what we also know is that under Elon Musk, there's been a range of regressive decisions and choices made that have really exacerbated these issues. So you may be aware, that there's this new system whereby premium users or verified subscribers, as they're known, who can get blue ticks. It used to be that only kind of verified people, notable personalities, public figures would do this. And now it's a paid model. So basically anyone, no matter what kind of hate or misinformation they want to spew, can just pay for extra amplification. And our analysis of the source code of the algorithm shows that those who are paying can have their tweets, their posts amplified far more than the average user. In addition to that, they have fired many, if not all, of their content moderators. They have done away with a lot of their trust and safety teams. And of course, they've made big changes to their speech policies as well to enable and allow much more abusive and hateful speech that does not align with human rights responsibilities and standards. And another important point another policy decision I would point to in the context of the UK is Elon Musk's decision after his takeover to reinstate previously banned accounts. And that includes the likes of Tommy Robinson and Andrew Tate and others who obviously are notorious far-right figures who have been who were previously banned for their like hate speech and other harmful behavior on the platforms. And those people were reinstated, and they ended up playing a very prominent role in the amplification of harmful content and misinformation in the context of this racist violence that erupted last year. So as we can see, in totality, under Elon Musk, there has been a serious deterioration. It's hard to say exactly how the algorithm changed because these things are quite opaque. It's a bit of a black box. But when we look at the full picture, it's clear that things have gotten much worse.
Yeah, and you mentioned misinformation. I think it's obviously very clear that there's been a lot more harmful, outright racist content. I mean, I think even for the average user, you don't need to look at the backlog, the source code. You can see it. It's very visual. It's very open in your face. But misinformation is also a very big issue. Can you talk to us about that and what's happened over the last couple of years, and how far back do you think that misinformation on Twitter has really sort of captured the platform?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at kind of the new speech policies that have been introduced under Elon Musk. He has repeatedly stated and gone on the public record to say that he thinks content moderation as a concept is a kind of form of censorship, and that rules and regulations that have been introduced in order to try and bring misinformation to heel, to reduce it, and to make social media less toxic are forms of censorship. And he's pushed back very hard against them. And the platform policies have really reflected this kind of ideology that he has sought to instill across the platform. And this is manifested in different ways. For example, we saw one of the first things that he did was to withdraw from an important voluntary code of conduct that the EU had created, for example, on mis and disinformation. That was an early signal, I think, of how he and the company was intending to approach these things going forward. And as you said, it's almost common sense now. You just need to open your X feed and you see so much vitriol, so much misinformation. And I think what's important with this research is that we've been able to verify a lot of that by looking under the hood and doing that technical work that hopefully can enable some accountability. Because from a human rights perspective, this is not acceptable. Companies like X have human rights responsibilities, and they're clearly failing to uphold them in this case.
I mean, we've seen more and more reports that are coming out and saying that there's lots of bots on the internet. Sort of proving the dead internet theory is true, exposing bots on social media, and Twitter has a lot of them. In any of your findings, have you seen a sort of correlation between bots and far-right content?
We didn't include a systematic study of bot behavior or prevalence in this particular research. But one thing I would say on that front is that as part of our analysis, we did come across changes to the Blue verified system that I mentioned before, whereby verification requirements, so identity verification requirements, were greatly reduced. So you can imagine that creates a situation whereby inauthentic accounts, whether it's bots or people posing as others or whatever it may be, have less verification requirements, and therefore are able to pose as others or engage in inauthentic behavior at scale. Obviously, with the rise of generative AI and AI in general, it's possible to engage in this kind of coordinated inauthentic behavior, as it's known, at scale in a way that previously wasn't possible. So the ingredients are out there for various actors who may be on the far right to engage in this kind of behavior, to flood the platform should they so wish. But it wasn't specifically part of this study.
Now, Sasha Deshmukh says that nothing has really changed for online safety, and this is a year on from the riots. I mean, do you think the Online Safety Act, and a lot of people have criticisms of the bill, do you think it can address some of this?
So the Online Safety Act, I mean, we had certain concerns about it when it was in draft form. Although I would say, first and foremost, I think it's important to say we as Amnesty, we absolutely believe that regulation of social media, of big tech, of the internet is an absolutely vital tool that must be taken on by regulators, by governments, to bring these companies to account. They have largely existed in a space of self-regulation for years, for decades. And we really see that as a root cause of so many of the societal and human rights harms that we are now experiencing. That long-term development of this toxic business model whereby they're surveilling us en masse, collecting our intimate personal data, and then designing algorithms to addict and engage us and keep our eyeballs on platforms for as long as possible, no matter the cost, meaning that they will prioritize the most harmful content so that we will stay on the platform. And the societal human rights impacts are clear, I think, to many of us by now. So we do need regulation, but we also need good regulation. And as you said, the Online Safety Act is a deeply imperfect piece of legislation. So, much of it has just come into force. So it's quite early to say exactly how effective or ineffective it will be. But we have been quite clear from the beginning that it has significant gaps, that there are still significant gaps that make it unlikely that these harms will be appropriately addressed. So we're calling for those gaps to be filled, as in we need to see mandatory human rights due diligence on the part of big tech companies so that these algorithms are actually subject to appropriate oversight and accountability so that they can't fuel this type of violence and offline harm. But there are some aspects of the Online Safety Act that are relevant in this case. It does give powers to Ofcom, to the government, to investigate the companies, to demand information, to hold them to account, and potentially, where violations have been found, to incur penalties. And we do need to see that. At least that is a step forward to the pure self-regulation that existed before. But as we've said, there are still a lot of gaps. There are still a lot of problems. So we do also need to see those addressed as well.
That was Pat de Bruin from Amnesty and author of the report. Ashton, I'll quickly go to you. I mean, I can go ahead and assume you're not surprised by this, but what's your response to the evidence that Twitter is deliberately stoking hate and misinformation?
Yeah, I guess I'm not obviously surprised by that, but I also think, I mean, look, I don't know this area very well, so this is just like my general feeling is that there was a time on the left where we really didn't know which position to have. I mean, there's different positions on this, on like what you should take. Let me just start from the beginning. On like, what is our position on fascists? Obviously, we oppose fascists, but do we ask the state or do we ask institutions to ban fascists, or do we ban them ourselves? Right? That's the first question. So there are political organizations on the left who say we should go to the state, these organizations, and people shouldn't march through our streets. And there's people much more in my political tradition that are like, we don't need to ask the state to ban them. We will ban them in the streets with our fists if we have to, right? And so that political tradition says the reason we don't ban them from the state isn't because we think we're some like, I mean, I think free speech is very important, but it's because ultimately the bans on them will hurt us more. And so if we see that that's demonstrated over and over again, and this again isn't speaking to the fact that Elon Musk is probably a fascist and is probably pushing for this. I'm not denying that. But if you look at Meta, for example, Meta owns Facebook and Instagram, they are far more restrictive on, I don't know about right-wing speech, but certainly left-wing speech, especially anti-imperialist and pro-Palestinian speech, consistently anti, right? Look at TikTok. I don't know if any of you guys are into TikTok, but in TikTok, it's like if you're making TikTok videos, you can't even use any of the words that is remotely tied to Palestine. And actually, and we found this consistently, and I don't know if there's any research on this, but it's like almost a running joke. If you put an Israel flag on your Twitter handle, and people have found this to be the case, but don't quote me on this, it like consistently will have more views. And so there's, they've been pushed into the position of having to do this because the ADL, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, which is a Zionist organization in America, said our biggest threat is TikTok and the kind of, because to them, it's all a comm strategy. It's not the fact that like people are acutely aware that their money is going to incinerate children as they sleep in Gaza. So to them, it's all a comm strategy. So they have to shut this down. And there's been a conscious and deliberate effort to do that with TikTok. With Twitter, it is the case that like you're not really restricted. You can post pro-Palestinian things, especially in the U.S. where there's far more free speech, especially around so-called prescribed organizations and what they're doing. That kind of speech has historically, I don't know about anymore, but historically been protected in the U.S. Whereas in Britain, for example, attacks on institutions that were arming the genocide those were far more protected until recently, until the Labour government came in. And those weren't protected in America, whereas speech isn't really protected in Britain and speech is protected in America. So, for example, I mean, there's loads of examples of this even recently. So what that means is that, like, actually, of course, them stoking fascism is bad, but also the fact that they've been like, they're sort of almost militantly free speech that we haven't. I mean, there are obviously times when people have been kicked off Twitter or whatever, but we actually haven't seen the level of control and restriction even remotely close to how much we've seen in other platforms like meta platforms like Instagram and Facebook, and definitely TikTok. So I guess I'm not trying to shift that. I'm saying, yes, I don't know this research. I haven't read the research and it doesn't surprise me, but I'd rather really, as long as we're using these platforms, and I'm still on Twitter, and Blue Sky, no offense, it's kind of dead right now, right? So it's like, it's just like, it's too nice. People don't want to be there. Like, everyone's just like, you're the best. Like, nobody wants that. So it's like, Twitter is where you're going to actually get the largest impact. It's also all the press is on there. All the media establishment are there. So if you get something big on Twitter, people, it's a way of things becoming news. Now, this is not me advocating for Twitter, certainly not. But I'm saying that until we get a sort of alternative, these are the institutions we use, and they're certainly better than existing institutions like the BBC. I mean, I was supposed to be on BBC last night, do like 5 different shows, and they wrote me like a couple hours before, being like, "Sorry, we saw a tweet, me literally saying I'm going to be on BBC, saying I'm going to be on BBC tonight on these different shows, talking about state recognition, and that's meaningless." As our government continues its distraction, and also that like Israel's like acting like they don't want it when there's 147 countries that already recognize Palestine, and it means nothing when this country is actively exterminating any Palestinians. So it's like from both sides. So because I said that, they're like, we can't do this because, but it just speaks to the fact that here I'm posting on Twitter, which everyone's like, oh, it's this big bad thing, which it is bad, don't get me wrong. But then because of that, which was like, BBC's like, we're not even going to have you on the show. So like, to me, I'm like, these institutions are way, way worse, and yeah, I mean, like, these are the ones that advocated with no alternative views consistently for wars of aggression, the Iraq war, illegal wars, even until recently. I mean, even recently they've been terrible on Gaza, but I mean, we've just seen, and they're the ones who mediate it. Whereas at least on Twitter, there's some possibility that we can push back.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, actually, especially what happened with the BBC over a tweet. I suppose, yeah, I mean, Twitter, I'm still on Twitter, by the way, and I kind of agree with you on Blue Sky. I'm over there. I don't really use it enough because it's basically milquetoast liberals at the moment. There's not even a lot of leftists on there, but I like a debate. But It's at least on these horrendous platforms, you can try and break through, although I'm worried about the Online Safety Act. There's censorship going on, especially with stuff going on in Palestine, which, by the way, we are going to talk about Israel and Palestine in a second. But before we get onto that, I just want to say that if you're enjoying the stream, then please like and subscribe. Just to remind viewers that we are 5 volunteers. We do not get paid for this work, but one day we would love for this to be our full-time job. And maybe we replace the BBC. Is that a bit too ambitious? I don't know. So if you can, then consider becoming a supporter by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There you could become a monthly patron, or there is another link for a one-off donation. Of course, you could also become a YouTube member for just 99p. Now on to our final story of the evening. Lindsay Hoyle has blocked the release of emails he sent to Israeli politicians. Responding to a Freedom of Information request lodged by Declassified UK, the UK government said Hoyle was the individual who had chosen not to release written correspondence since October 2023 between himself and the Israeli embassy, Labour Friends of Israel, and members or officials of the Knesset. The response said that Hoyle has formed the reasonable opinion that disclosure of the information would be likely to prejudice the effective conduct of public affairs. Oh, you think that, do you? Might the release of these emails show your loyalty to Israel, or at least a pro-Israel bias that you don't want the public seeing? This is a string of instances where Hoyle has shown his bias toward Israel. Back in 2023, he visited Israel on a solidarity visit, but no solidarity to the Palestinians who are facing a genocide. Remember when he intervened on the SNP's opposition day, where they called for a ceasefire at a time when Labour barely even wanted to utter those words. It's pretty disgraceful that we have a sitting speaker where no one challenges his seat is openly batting for Israel. Ashok, I mean, again, we're not surprised at Lindsay's allegiances here, but what he's hiding could be significant, maybe even damning. In your estimation, how deep does the Israeli lobby go?
Pretty deep. I think, look, also let's remember that Lindsay Hoyle's father was a founding member of Labour Friends of Israel. I think on both sides of the Atlantic, still reckoning. And I don't know if people have been following the newest stuff that's happening on the MAGA right. And I think Israel is more afraid of the MAGA right than they are the left. It's similar to this. This is like small fry, because Britain is a failed state, and it's like hanging on the coattails for desperation of the American empire. It's like they're sending ships to the South China Sea while like 1 million children last year stood in bread lines. I mean, it's not a serious country. Israel doesn't have to do much to have a lot of state capture in this country. Two things here. There was a time, Britain and America helped create Israel because at the time, for a series of reasons, Israel was a strategic, it's like having a military base in this choke point between Africa and Asia when that empire was crumbling, and they found this resource, oil. And so it was about controlling oil. It was about geopolitics. It was about, having one of your people there. And that was how it was sold from day one. If you read the early documents, it's very clear that was a military base. That was in their interest, whatever. Now, and this is a controversial thing on the left, and it's up for debate, people like Adam Mania and Andreas Malm don't necessarily agree with them. I really respect them. And there's other people who see these changes happening. Is that part of the disjuncture and the tension, the contradiction between the interests of the empire, which is America and Britain, which is having Israel, is now slowly weaning, right? Because it's like it isn't in the interests of Britain and America, the empire, the Western Empire. America really, and Britain kind of whatever. It isn't in their interest that Israel murders children every day and slaughters people and starves people to death. Like, that's not actually in the interest. That's interest in a genocidal, fascistic settler state that needs to constantly expand, and fascism is at its core. Absolutely. And we see that over and over again. And Patrick Wolf's work on this is excellent. It's nothing new. Israel is an extreme and grotesque example of what you found in America when it was a settler, when it was exterminating the indigenous people here, or Australia and other places, right? The issue is that because Israel requires the support through diplomatic support, through financial support, through arms, whatever, it requires the support specifically of America and to a much lesser extent Britain and Germany. That means that disjuncture, the gulf between the imperial need for Israel to be Israel and actually Israel's liability is paid through hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying, hundreds of millions of dollars of basically bribery, paying officials off, paying for elections. And I would point to, and again, this is still out there, and I don't want to seem like some wacky crank, the debate that's happening in the MAGA right now, in the base of the MAGA right, which is really very, very fierce, and it's tearing it apart. And this is people like Tucker Carlson's leading this, and Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes, and all these people who represent really the right to varying degrees, and have always been quite critical, or mostly been critical. Candace Owens a bit recently, but critical of Israel, are focusing on the Jeffrey Epstein case. And the reason why that's relevant here is because there is, with a lot of evidence, because Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Lord Maxwell, was one of the leading spies of the country, and lots of evidence that he was killed by Mossad, and that they were introduced to each other. There's loads of evidence to support the case that lots of this was about developing compromat material on elected officials. The reason why it's tearing them apart, and the reason why Congress, and this is articulated by the congressional majority leader, is that the reason why they closed Congress down 2 weeks early is because Democrats had proposed the Epstein Disclosure Act, which would have with Republicans actually, to disclose all of the 10,000 video footage that Pam Bondi, who's the Attorney General, that to release that to the public, and Trump is refusing to release that. And so there's this idea, born in a lot of evidence, that he may have been basically an Israeli a Mossad official. Ghislaine Maxwell might have been as well, and they were gathering compromat material on very famous people. And that's why they closed down the U.S. Congress weeks early, so they don't have to see that bill. The bill will come up when Congress opens up again after a session, after the recess period's over. And the reason why I tell you this vignette isn't because I'm trying to speculate wildly. Of course, this is still speculation. It's that the right holds an enormous amount of power, way more than the left, in terms of what its influence is, especially in American politics now. And that's why when Netanyahu came to America, he spent 3 days there. 1 day with Trump and all congressional politicians, and 2 days attempting to meet with right-wing influencers, because they can see that the right-wing influencers, and that's why they went on the Naut Boys, and that was highly controversial, even for the right. And then they went on a tour trying to assuage everybody and say, no, we didn't mean anything by this, and they've apologized since. The reason why it's so important is if the right, this traditional base, collapses, in this country, it's represented by people like Tommy Robinson, who's already a marginal character. These are institutionally right characters. Like Tucker Carlson had a show on Fox News. Candace Owens has millions and millions of followers. They're not like a cokehead who's basically a mess, which is what Tommy Robinson, was paid by Israel. The fact that it's collapsing in the right in the U.S. is terrifying for Zionists in Israel. And in some ways, I think, to some extent, they're trying to do everything now. Kill as many Palestinians, starve out Gaza, occupy Gaza, murder as many people, and occupy as much as West Bank, because they know the time is limited. The geriatrics are dying. The boomers are dying. As they die off, the left hates them, the right hates them, and the Democrats also are being squeezed effectively, and the Republicans are being squeezed. And so it's becoming a case that Israel is a massive, massive liability. And the fact that Israel isn't actually necessarily as much as the imperial interest as it was 50 years ago. And so hundreds of millions of dollars isn't going to make up for that gulf. And so, and even if with the election of Zoran Mamdani, you have 70% of Jews in New York that just came out. That 70% of Jews in New York support Zoran Mamdani. So even amongst young Jewry, there isn't really a support for, they'll say, the Netanyahu government. It's only going to move to the right in Israel. That's the contradiction. People don't understand. It's not moving to the left. It's moving to the right. And so on this Lindsay Hoyle question, and it's a circular argument, of course there's state capture, and it might come in many different forms. It can come in money. It can come in compromat. And I'm not saying compromat is in, oh my God, some vast conspiracy. Every country tries to get compromising material on powerful people, because people like the Clintons can't really be paid off because they have tons of money. They're corrupt as hell, but they have tons of money. The only thing they care about is their reputation. And so that's why, who knows what the reason is. And again, I'm not making any speculation here. I'm just saying it's very obvious that the reason why politicians are constantly holding water for this state isn't just, and again, I don't want to be reductive in the way that lots of people who are anti-imperialists on the left think. It's like, oh, it's because it's in the imperialist interest of the West. Of course it's in the imperialist interest of the West. We didn't need a vast Ukrainian lobby for them to be complete Russophobia weeks after NATO aggression and Russian aggression in Ukraine. There was full kind of ascension and hegemonic agreement that Russia bad, Ukraine good, let's go to war. You didn't need some big lobby to do that. So of course there's a kind of logic and interest that exists there. But there's also this massive institution it's so in their existential interest to buy off politicians and gather compromat material and ensure that they have state capture in Britain, specifically in America, but also Britain and Germany.
I think that's a really interesting point you made about Israel being scared of the right over the left. First of all, it's true. The left doesn't really have any institutional power. So who's going to be scared of the left? In terms of the right, though, it's not scared that the right are going to come after them. It's that they're going to lose their support base. Because obviously, you've kind of got two factions within the far right. You've got those that are just like the sort of neo-Nazis who just hate Israel because of Jews. But then you've got the other part of the far right who want to emulate Israel because of apartheid. Those sorts of arguments are trying to be brought over here. They want an ethno-state over here, just like Israel. It's not that they support Jewish people, by the way, but that's the way they operate. I mean, that's a very
I
interesting
would
point.
kind of maybe disagree with that in the
Sure.
sense that like I don't think it's that. Okay, so it's like I think there are elements of what you said, of course, but then there are people who are like our country. There's a libertarian streak of the right that says we
True.
shouldn't be giving money to any country, and they've always opposed war. And this is people like Tucker Carlson. I think comes from maybe a little bit more from that tradition now. And I also think there's people who think that yes, they think it's about Jews, and I think certainly Nick Fuentes thinks that. But I think that it's also that there was this idea on the left that said the only way you can fight racism abroad is to fight racism at home. This is a line that was said. With Tony Blair, yeah, they're like Sure Start programs and DEI, blah, 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 and he murders 1 million people. Obama, oh my God, Obama, he says he speaks in Arabic sometimes when he arrives in Cairo, and he doesn't say racist stuff, but then he deports the most migrants in American history and like murders tens of thousands of people from death machines in the sky. So, but then you get someone like from the right, and lots of these people on the right, very fascistic at home domestically, but globally don't want to murder anyone, right? They don't want any wars. It's not just Israel's wars. They don't want any wars. So that's not me saying this is good. I just think at all, but I'm saying it's certainly good if you oppose war. And for me, the most important thing, the biggest force in the world for death, misery, and immiseration in the world is the U.S. empire. And so anything that helps erode that, yes, it's bad. Violent deportations, terrible. Of course. Like the Muslim ban. Obama did the Muslim ban in 2010. It was just expanded by 4 countries. It was 10 countries in Obama. It was expanded by 4 countries in Trump, and it was called the Muslim ban. Like, like even with deportations, Biden deported twice as many people as Trump did. Twice as many people as Trump did. He just didn't say, I hate Mexicans and blah, blah, blah. This isn't me trying to reduce Trump is terrible, but and obviously what he's doing now is awful. But the point is that there's a faction of the right there that means that the actions that he's doing, it's tearing apart the base. It's tearing it apart. The base hates Trump. Yes, he's doing okay in the polls right now, but that doesn't really matter because once the actual election happens, you need the base, which mobilizes people and organizes people. It's not just this like zero something. That's why the base matters so much. So with Zohar Mamdani is just a perfect example. People might not have known who he was and have a strong opinion about it, but because he built such a strong cadre of volunteers and organizers and he mobilized the base, he was able to expand that and build on it. And so Trump needs a strong base. And if his base collapses, it becomes very difficult for a future. And that's why there's this idea, especially around the right, if you follow the right, which I follow the right, like because I'm interested in them, where they say, oh, this is a way of getting Vance in, JD Vance, the VP, who's like basically this hand-selected person of lots of different people, like Silicon Valley types. And it just won't happen. It's like the base is collapsing, especially on the Epstein stuff, especially with the war in Iran, especially because, yesterday, it's the thing that was all over the right-wing Twitter is that Trump has come out and said, if you're in any state and you support BDS, you won't get any FEMA funding. This is funding for hurricane relief or whatever. And the right is exploding around this. And so these tensions it's an existential crisis for Israel. It's not good politics. It's actually objectively in lots of ways, especially on domestic issues, bad. But on the question of Israel, it's actually positive in eroding a crucial support that Israel needs to survive.
I mean, I think there's the Epstein stuff is the one that's really destroying his base, because I think when it came to the rhetoric around anti-war, there was too many of the base who were still pro-war, despite the fact that they pretended they weren't. I mean, you had Charlie Kirk, for example, and he'd be saying, oh my God, not Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris is going to keep on the forever wars, vote for Trump, and they're going to be the most peaceful cabinet.
Yeah.
As soon as he bombed Iran, they didn't care.
I mean, Charlie Kirk is definitely someone who is far more, he's less MAGA, more institutionally Republican, I think. I mean, these distinctions are rather different, but they are like, he's chairing the event at CPAC. This is like a right-wing convention. He's not one of the people speaking at it. You know what I mean? There's event, he's like much more 1 foot out, 1 foot in the institutions. The people that speak to the base are much more the Tuckers, the Candaces, the Nick Fuenteses, right? And so again, hugely reactionary, especially in Fuentes, but very charismatic, has a massive base, and is very hostile towards Israel. So it's the Epstein stuff. You're absolutely right. Epstein stuff is like the perfect combination of state capture by in the minds of the right, but also I think there's a lot of evidence for this. State capture by of a foreign entity of America, and elitist pedophile rings in which for the right and the left, like Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, are coming together to go to some island. I mean, it's like this is just. It's like everything's coming together. I mean, basically, loads of right-wing conspiracists have been saying this for decades, and it's all come just so crystallized. And Trump runs on releasing the files. He's like, "We got to release the files. We got to release them." He comes in and he's like, he just says this 3 weeks ago. They're like, Epstein, you got to get over this Epstein. That guy's been dead for ages, man. Literally, Epstein was like, "This is my best friend for 10 years," you know. So it's very, very, very. It's literally like a sulfuric acid to the MAGA base, and that's good in so many ways. It collapses the right, because the point of the left winning is also we need the right to collapse, obviously. True. But then also what it does is it makes Israel and anything associated with Israel, and that's what this is to some extent. It's pedophilia, obviously, but then it's also. And it's sex trafficking, but it's also, and it's powerful people doing sex trafficking, but it's also state capture by Israel and compromat. And it's just like, it's so seedy in every way. And it's that makes it such a liability that increasingly it'll be the case that, I mean, look, you know, the fact that Bernie was able to get 25 U.S. senators out of 100, 25 to sign on, people like Klobuchar from Minnesota, terrible politician, signed on to stop giving arms and funding to Israel. I mean, that's unimaginable a couple of years ago.
I want to bring this back to Lindsay Hoyle a second, because I think this collective agreement of candidates not standing in the speaker seat has to go.
It's got to go.
He's supposed to be impartial. Evidently, he isn't. So maybe we could see someone from the Corbyn Sultana party stand, if they're ready, by the next general election.
Wait, that's okay. There's so many things. First of all, next general election, if it happens in 2029, right?
True. Yeah.
If it happens before there, I don't think it'll happen before that. Even though Starmer's very weak, that won't be good for us, because I think if it happens in imagine it happens in 2026, right? We're not set up enough. We get 5 or 6 seats, 7 seats with the independents, 10 seats potentially. I think that's very possible. If that happens, especially if we get an agreement with the Greens, if that happens, we still become marginalized. And then it becomes reform is dominant, and the opposition party to that still remains Labour. And so then it becomes, when election time comes in 2030 or 2031 or whatever, it's like, oh my God, we have to get reform out because he said some bad things, even though Labour's immigration policy is exactly what reform would have done or will have done. So it's like, obviously reform's terrible, but I'm just saying, this will just be like, okay, so everybody's going to push center, just like we saw with Berlusconi, what we see with Trump. Instead, if we build capacity, it gets to 2029, and then let's say we build enough and we get our shit together and we like have an agreement or whatever. Let's say we have 40, 50 seats. Greens get another 5, 6, 7 seats. Then you got Plaid Cymru, you get SNP with 10 seats, Plaid Cymru with 4 or 5 seats. You're talking 65, 70 people. That's capacity, right? That's significant capacity. And because in this country, the Labour Party's politicians are chosen in smoky back rooms on how many asses someone can kiss, not on how charismatic someone is, not how someone can speak. You know that Indian guy, like this guy with a beard who like gave the like lamest speech, his maiden speech, and he was like, it was so lame, it was so boring. He gave this boring speech, and then when he wrote his thing, he was like, #no notes. And I'm like, yo, bro, that ChatGPT speech, like, why would you need notes for that? You sound like an Autobot. But all these people sound like this because it's about how many palms you greased and how much ass you kissed. And I don't know if you can curse on this show. I don't know.
You can absolutely, you can. Free reign.
So because of that, if you have 70 people who have like some real principles, some charisma, some ability, you'll make the Labour Party look like absolute losers, and then it'll be taken over by Wes Streeting, who looks like an animated Victorian doll, and they'll try to present him as some like, oh my God, voice of the working class. No one's buying it. At least Rayner, she has a little bit of like, she's got a little bit of like, she's got some style. She's got like some like, street cred.
I mean, she has
She's got something going on.
about
I mean, I can't stand
her,
her, but she's got something going on. She doesn't stand for anything, whatever. I know that, but she's got something going for her like that. Wes Streeting, he's like a wooden Victorian doll. His face, it's like just plastic. So no one's buying it. Every one of his people, it's going to be completely. I mean, I remember Wes Streeting. I was running basically the LSE Students Union when he was president of the National Union of Students. And he had just like he just built sycophants around him. So that's the party we're talking about.
Yeah, we've heard about his time at the NUS.
At that time, if that happens, then I don't know if we could get a speaker out of it. But if the conditions are right, I mean, in a negotiation, let's say that this coalition of parties are negotiating power. I certainly don't think we should be negotiating for speaker. I think the things that we should be prioritizing obviously are things like putting PR, like, I don't know how long the show goes for, but I'll just say this. People should read this if you haven't read it. There's a 1963 pamphlet by a French Trotskyist named André Gorz called Strategy for Labor. And Strategy for Labor is just talking about, it's trying to intervene in the debate between reformism and revolutionary politics, right? And they're saying there are reforms that you can introduce that fundamentally transform capitalist relations. And those are the things that we need to focus on. How do we get people, it's like, when the Bolsheviks ran their election, it was bread and peace. So you meet people's needs, but you also try to transform society. So it's like things like potentially PR, but also things that decommodify the essentials of society, right? Things that will be very difficult for them to take away once it's given, right? So like universal policies, not means testing, policies that are like universal basic services. Those are things that we should prioritize. And I think we should make it policy that if there's any negotiations, if we become part of a coalition, let's imagine, that nobody gets any, like, look at what the Lib Dems did. The Lib Dems ran free education 2010, free education against Trident, pro-migrant, like basically what the Greens are running now, right? But the Greens are much better, don't get me wrong, because they have good people that are going to take it over. But they are, when it came to negotiations, they got some ministerial roles, 10p, 5p bags and like AV vote that that lost, right? So in any kind of negotiations, I don't think these kinds of positions, I'm not saying you're saying that. I know you're just using that as a way to discuss this. It shouldn't really, ministerial roles should be secondary to agreements on policies that transform society. Ministerial roles, they can be kicked out at any time, and they're basically factotums. They're like cogs in a machine for whoever's running the party.
Love what you're saying about universalism, by the way. It's 20 to 9, so we are going to go to your comments. It's been a very lively chat. I'm sure there's a lot to go in there. And hello to our producer, Sarah.
Hi, hello. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Nice. Okay, so really, really great conversations and such a great show. I'll just jump into the comments straight away. Jacqueline said, oh, actually, sorry. I'm doing this so wrong, guys. I've not done this in a while. Let's talk to this. Let's go to the super chats, shall we? Super chats. Jim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Much appreciated.
10 live memberships, and then we had £5 from Border Prince. So thank you so much. He said Twitter. Oh, sorry, I mean X is a hellscape. Great show.
It was paining me to say X when I was reading the quotes.
I knew it was.
But it was a quote.
I knew it. I knew you hated it because I always call it X, and I don't use Twitter. I don't use it at all. And Becca as well. Thank you so much for 5 left memberships. Okay, now into the comments. So, Jacqueline said, no US president will be fully anti-war. That was just going off of what you guys were talking about. I know that you kind of like ventured away from Lindsay Hoyle slightly, but I found this conversation quite interesting because I don't think anyone pretends that the US will ever be anti-war, because it never will be. Not now, not ever. And the US in and of itself is this empire, like the most militarized empire in modern history. Like they literally have over 800 military bases in 80 countries. It's fucking wild. And what has that actually brought to the world? Like, Ashik, you'd listed most of the countries that they've done damage in, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Libya, Panama, Yemen. Like the list is extensive. But I think even when the US says it wants peace, what it actually means is we want control without resistance. And it always comes through this very, very like the same language over and over, like this whole, oh, it's all about security, it's about stability, it's humanitarian intervention. But actually, like, no, what you're looking for is extracting resources and market access and like geopolitical dominance. And they've done that for such a long time. But yeah, I don't know if you guys wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, can I comment on this?
Of course, please.
Okay, yeah, I think obviously the U.S. is an empire, and it's it'll never be anti-war. But I do want to point to a few examples, and if you look at, for example, the war in Syria in 2013, the then David Cameron brought to a vote. So Obama says, I want to send in ground troops into Syria, right? And because like Assad has passed like some line that we just established, and that's been contested by lots of people like Aaron Mate and others, that if that actually happened. But that's another question. So obviously Britain, lapdog, is like, okay, we have to obviously follow America wherever they go. No other country decides to do this. So Cameron's like, okay, let's put it to a vote. Let's put it to a vote of Parliament. There's a war vote hasn't been voted against by Parliament in the British Parliament since the 1700s, right? That's been put forward by the Prime Minister. So he puts it forward. Originally, Ed Miliband, who's the leader of the opposition, supports it. He's like, oh yeah, of course, war, we support that. We love that. But because there was so much pressure, and I would say give real credit to the anti-war movement here, put pressure on him, and then he does, and the lessons and what Tony Blair has been known for as a result of the Iraq War, he puts a whip and says, vote against it. So they vote against it alongside Lib Dems, Greens, others, and it fails. Because of that failure, the U.S. didn't send in ground troops. Of course, the U.S. bombed them and whatever. But the reason, and we know this is true because in Obama's 2020 memoir, he says there was a massive buildup for the war, and that parliamentary vote and them voting it down, quote, took the wind out of the sails for a Syria war. And so what that tells you is that actually it's not a foregone conclusion. It's not that the U.S. will go to war. It's that we, through our organization, especially Britain, because we're a lapdog and because we play such an essential role as sous chef to this war, to the U.S. empire, we have a more powerful position to try and stop the Americans from going to war. And I mean, look at even Yemen. Yemen they had a country of 20 countries originally under Obama to stop the Yemen blockade. Operation Prosperity Guardian, which failed. And then Trump didn't even ask those countries, went and started bombing Yemen. And then Trump probably didn't even ask Starmer to do this. Starmer sent planes over to bomb Yemen. And then obviously they lost, and they did an agreement behind Israel's back with Ansar Allah, who successfully not only enforced a blockade, but defeated the coalition of 20 countries and Americans and Britain. But the point is that Britain is always playing the secondary role to the Americans. I mean, this is also why when the buildup to the Iran war, the bombing, Starmer was getting all our forces ready to potentially go to war. We can't forget that. That's what
that man is war hungry. You got to tell me, Starmer is war hungry.
So
yeah, I mean, like with Jacqueline saying, I mean, you're right in the sense that like you can have a president that genuinely wants to be anti-war, but it's the systems around them, the structures around them. But of course, you're absolutely right. Pressure from the ground can change things, and that's kind of all. It's kind of the way it's going to be, isn't it? It's going to be the way it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just go to the next one. On to Lindsay Hoyle. I find these so funny. I love little. I love it when people do this. Just stop Hoyle, and also said Lindsay Boyle is compromised. I love it. I don't know why this sort of stuff makes me crazy.
Lindsay Boyle.
Yeah. But yeah, and also sorry, thank you Specs as well for 5.
Thank you.
Memberships. Shannon said, Hoyle deciding it's not in the public interest for his own emails to be released. How is that his decision, or anyone who works directly for him? Should be 100% independent body deciding. Completely agree. What do you guys want to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, otherwise you can have these sort of relations, these back and forth emails, these secret alliances that we don't hear about. And of course, they're not going to expose it themselves. And I do wonder how sinister, maybe it's not, I don't know, maybe this is me being a bit conspiratorial here, but you do wonder what's in these emails.
Of course it's not conspiratorial.
It's not conspiratorial.
It's not conspiratorial at all. Imagine, here's how you know it's not conspiratorial. imagine a country, I don't know, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Africa, somewhere in the Caribbean, that everybody, the assumption, all of a sudden, the racist assumptions already, that this has happened, right? This country is going to a neighboring country, they're bombing that country, doing whatever for the interests of whatever, the dominant country and dominant player there who's committing a genocide. The leader of the house or the speaker of the house of that country has had secret talks with that group and says, it's in the public interest that I don't release it. And then they say, there's no ability to hold them accountable. We would look at that and we would laugh. We'd be like, this is some kind of banana republic or whatever.
Yeah.
But when it happens in Britain, it's like, oh, this is completely normal. No, this is nuts.
It's so nuts.
Normal.
No, it's not normal at all. And actually, that reaction is exactly what I have as well. Because, like, you have to let that sink in. Like, there are literally Palestinian civilians that are being crushed under rubble, entire hospitals being bombed, and you've got the Speaker of the House of Commons being like, oh, sorry, I'm not going to show you anything. Like, I'm sorry, it's a fucking moral collapse.
He's a genuinely disgraceful person. I'm still reeling from the SNP opposition.
The SNP,
yes.
It was insane.
So outrageous.
And he got to stay there because of this.
Yeah, and like actually, you kind of pointed to this as well, Ashik. Like this whole like our role as Britain, like a former colonial empire, in aiding and abetting yet another Cessna colonial project, like that needs to sink in quite considerably. And it's about whether the British state, from ministers to the Speaker of the House, is willing to stand on the side of like morality or on the side of like impunity. And I think we know where they're at the moment.
Well, I mean, as Ashok was saying earlier, I completely agree. We're a failed state.
So failed. Yeah.
The US and the UK just failed states.
Yeah, do you remember that interview that was with the Chinese ambassador, where they were like, Starmer thinks that you guys like they're really concerned about like you're like maybe you're like against us or something, and he just was like, we don't think about you guys. What are you talking about? Like, and like, I love that. Like a few years ago, they were like, last year, Starmer was like, we're sending boats to the South China Sea. It's like, your tugboats to the South China Sea? Like, nobody cares about us. Like, just
don't give a fuck.
Don't like, this is embarrassing. Everyone knows. It's like, we're like Scrappy Doo. Do you remember Scrappy Doo?
Yeah.
We're like, we're gonna do it. It's like,
actually, it's kind of embarrassing being British, isn't it?
Fuck.
Well, I'm not British, so
I know. You're lucky you, but
I'm American, which is even more embarrassing.
Well, true.
That's worse.
It's like, I'm not British. Okay, cool. I'm American.
Yeah. And Jim said onto Twitter now, wait, you're telling me that selling the world's town centre to an apartheid South African Nepo baby psychopath straight out of Moonraker was a bad thing? And it's true, like, it's a fucking mess. And then Katie said, just on Twitter again, I urge everyone to leave that fash hell site. I'm no longer on it because dealing with anti-vaxxers, xenophobes and racists of all stripes gets tiring, and burnout is really detrimental for us. And it's true. I have taken a huge step back from social media because it's so
I can't do it. I'm still addicted.
No, I'm not.
I'm still busy telling fascists that shut the fuck up, you fascist.
Yeah, facts. They need to be told, shut the fuck up, you're a fash, but they don't listen. And then Edward said, a platform owned by a fascist promoting fascism, who'd have thunk it? So yeah, and then on to my favourite topic ever, and I won't talk too much, but I don't know what this is. That a cat? It says rent controls. Yeah, rent controls would be so nice. A hard limit on residential property ownership would be good too. Nobody needs more than 4 properties, even as landlords.
4 properties.
4. I was thinking shit. 4 is a lot.
Trust me. Yeah, I agree, but I don't know. I've always said this. I've been very consistent. I just don't think that landlordism has to be something that exists. That's just
private landlordism, right? I mean, for me, I want the state to rent out all properties, rental properties.
Yeah,
it's not a crazy thing because it's something that we used to do.
It is something we used to do. It is. In the early 70s. No, it's me. I do the same. I will cut you off just as much as you might cut me off. So you go ahead.
Okay, I'll just say this. It's not a radical idea. John Maynard Keynes, the entire Keynesian economic model, which was basically late 40s into the 1970s, which is like under consumptionism, whatever. It's a welfare state. And it was called the golden era. It was like the most, you had 92.1% top marginal tax rate in America between 1951 and 1967. And that's because that was 92% basically of the top marginal tax rate. So you had a largely distributed society and you had a robust economy. He said, let's euthanize the landlords. I mean, this is a man who was basically the chief negotiator for the U.S. in its trade negotiations. So why does he say that? It's because the interests of, and Marx also writes about this in chapter 10 of volume 1 of Capital, but that basically the interests of the capitalist class and the interests of the aristocracy or the landlord class are exactly oppositional, and we should exploit that. So if you're a capitalist and you're like, I want to open up a cookie factory, I don't know, in London, you're like, it's going to cost me so much more to make a cookie and sell that cookie and be competitive, because the cost of labor is astronomical, because 2/3 of their money that they're spending is going to a landlord who's doing nothing for society and being a parasitic landlord. Right now, it's basically they're like a go between the banks and their tenants. Really, if you look at landlord interest rates, which are usually double what they are for like a normal person who lives in their house, but still, that's why the interests aren't the same. That's why it's so, if you're interested in growth, and they're not actually interested in growth, they're just interested in lining the pockets of the rich. If you're actually interested in even supply side growth, meaning you want more investors investing more in the real economy and employing more people, you would do rent controls, because that means you have more money in more people's pockets, and capitalists, in theory, could pay workers less. Now, I don't think they should pay workers less, but even by the logic of their own, like, brain melty capitalist ideology, it makes sense to have rent controls, and rent controls, if strong enough, effectively abolishes landlords.
And you know, Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith
Yes.
is not a leftist, not a communist. I mean, he was you could say the father of modern capitalism, was against landlords. In fact, if Adam Smith existed today, they would call him a hard left communist. But at least he understood. I mean, they would. Think about it. Think of the Tufton Street people. Yeah. Who's this bloody commie? Because at least he understood that there was so much value generated that produced a lot of money and wealth, but didn't produce a lot of social value.
Yeah.
And that's exactly obviously what the landlord or parasite class absolutely does. But it's funny, they would. The Adam Smith Institute probably would be like, who's this commie? And I'm like, yeah, the guy you've named your institute after.
Yeah, but also the argument that they're like, oh my God, then we won't have landlords. If you do rent controls, who's going to rent this out? Good. Housing prices collapse.
Get rid of them.
House. The state buys the house. We don't need these people.
We don't need you.
And then they'll be like, oh, but if you don't do rents, then no one's going to build. I'm like, housing prices collapse. Then the state builds.
Literally.
That's it.
But also, I'm really against the narrative, because I feel like they do push this narrative of like, they pretend there's an extraordinary shortage of homes, but there actually isn't. Like, it's untrue, because like international historical data shows that like we in Britain, I'm pretty sure I read an article like a year ago, I don't know if it's still the same, it probably is, but the UK homes per capita ratio, it actually exceeds the US. So we have a lot of homes in this country that are available. But if I think it's a fruitless debate when it comes to supply. So whenever someone's like, well, we need to just build more homes, I'm like, actually, we don't need some ecologically damaging project. What we do need to do is actually think about getting rid of landlords and rent controls. So yeah, agreed.
On that point, I would just want to add, and we've done this in Tower Hamlets, and people have done it in Islington, and people have done it in Wandsworth. Since the 2018 Housing Act, every local authority can double the council tax on empty properties, triple it on if your property has been empty for over 4 years, and quadruple it if it's been empty for 8 years. So what that means is you're disincentivizing empty homes. You should be pushing your council to enforce this and to implement this, because they can just basically hire an extra person that runs the data and implements it, and you can generate potentially millions of pounds and force landlords to rent it out, potentially sell their place, whatever. And so the problem, like you said, isn't that we don't have enough housing. We have plenty of housing. The problem is the marketization of housing.
Exactly. Landlordism, exactly. I could talk about it all day. I'm terrible.
Talk about it all day.
Let's talk about it all day.
We've got at least at Turn Left, and especially me and you, Sarah, we've got a big old hatred for landlordism.
Massive. I say that whilst I just paid my rent today. So the way you measure growth is like buying another new blazer, measure the chest and the sleeves, Curtis Daly 2025. So jokes. And then Carl said, desperate foreigners in boats equals bad, but rich foreigners sticking 1 billion straws into our economy and sucking out all the wealth, not even worth the mention, which I thought was quite interesting.
Well, they're the wealth creators, though, Carl, aren't they? Yeah. The wealth creators. Did you consider that?
If we introduce a wealth tax, they'll leave. And then Jacqueline also said, maybe you could comment on this, Ashok. I found out recently that Central Park used to be a village of black people, but that village was destroyed so they could build the park, and it wasn't the only place where that happened.
Yeah, look, if you look at the history of how cities are built, right? Especially, like I was saying, in the US, it's built almost purely for accumulation of capital. In Britain, you have these like pre-capitalist cities, like you go to Oxford or Cambridge. It's not built in this way, but you look at like London after the bombing, it's built in a different way. So if you look at all Western European states that were built after World War II, basically what you have is the poor people live in the east side of the cities, the rich people live in the west, because industry was in the center, and Atlantic winds meant that all the poor people would work in the factories and their children would be like consuming all the fumes of the city, and the wealthy would be in the west. So these cities, even pre-capitalist cities built after the war, that were rebuilt after the war, were built for the benefit purely for the rich, right? So like, and E.P. Thompson writes about this in the Great British Historian, about when they opened up Hyde Park. Hyde Park was opened up, and so people could go there, and then all of a sudden, all of these like aristocracy, wealthy people in the West London were like, wait, we don't want the riffraff from South London and East London coming here. So then they try and open up parks in other parts of the city as like estuaries so they could keep the poor from going there. So even places, of course, you still had these parks develop here, but even the fact that they had cities here where there were parks that existed, they existed almost, over time to shape the interests of the ruling class, but at least they existed. In the US, they basically existed like Central Park. The dispossession of Central Park in lots of places were dispossessed in the name of development was purely because the wealthiest properties in the world are the ones that line Central Park now, like in the world. And so I think it's like very obvious the case that like in the US, you don't have things, and this goes back to the discussion we had about allotments. There's no conception. There really isn't allotments in cities. There's no conception of that. And so everything they're trying to bring from the US, whether it's privatized healthcare or the destruction of cities, is like, it's not good. I grew up there. I'm looking into the future. I'm the crystal ball. Don't go there. It's terrible. We've got some good things here. We need to preserve it, and we need to build some more stuff.
Absolutely. Well said. And I think last comment from Coops, which I think we'll probably all agree with, which is a one-word answer. Selling off things we've paid into our local areas is wrong. School playfields, parks and recreation areas is wrong. The government are giving away our property. Yep, absolutely. Completely agree. But honestly, really great show. Thank you so much. I never know how to say bye. Bye.
Just I'm going to hand it back over.
That's actually a good line. I'll hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really appreciate great producing and great comments. I just want to say thank you to our viewers who tuned in. Of course, thank you to Ashok for joining me tonight. Fantastic conversations. Remember to like the stream, and if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. If you want us to grow, then you can head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There is a link to our Patreon where you can support us monthly, or follow the other link to give us a one-time contribution. Alternatively, you could become a YouTube member for just 99p. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.